From the moment we wake up, stress builds. Traffic, phone calls, emails, the economy, and politics. It turns out Americans are now experiencing the highest levels of stress, anger, and worry in a decade.
What could possibly go wrong? And it already stresses me out, even though it hasn't even happened yet.
You probably don't need the new Gallup poll to tell you Americans are among the most stressed people in the world. 55% of Americans say they experience stress a lot of the day, 45% feeling a lot of worry, while 22% felt a lot of anger. The rat race having a real impact on your health.
If your body's at a continued heightened awareness, it's going to start taking a toll on your body, particularly your heart health, your digestive health, your mental health.
It's not just rent, relationships, and our jobs raising our anxiety. Commuters here in Los Angeles spend up to 16 workdays a year in traffic, enough to make your blood boil.
But there is reason to smile. Despite our angst, Americans generally report more positive experiences than the rest of the world. So don't stress. It's not all bad news. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
Are you stressed? Raise your hand if you have any kind of problems in your life. There are some liars in this room. We all have stress, don't we? We all have problems. It's just a natural part of life, isn't it? Well, I have some relief for you. Here's a relief map of Colorado. Not the kind of relief you were looking for, is it? This is a map that hangs in the dining hall up at Ministry Haven. It's a 3D, I think it's called a relief map. It's three-dimensional. When you get to the eastern plains are nice and flat. I don't know, but nice, but they're flat. And then you get to the mountains and they stick up. It's three-dimensional. It's really a pretty cool map. Let me ask you something. Where is the most beautiful part of Colorado? Is it in the eastern plains, or what we refer to as West Kansas? Or is it in the mountains in the western slope? No, it doesn't, Nancy. The beautiful part's in the mountains. There's nothing beautiful about the flatlands. Well, we beg to differ with you. We'll agree to disagree, Nancy. Because if it's the flatlands, my whole sermon goes out the window. Okay, so it has to be the mountains. The mountains are the most beautiful part, right? You go over Dallas, that pull off there, it's one of the most photographed places in the country. The snow-covered mountains and the green aspen, and in the fall when the aspen are changing colors. And it's just the beauty in Colorado. People don't come to Colorado to go visit the beauty of the eastern plains, do they? They come to see the beauty of the mountains. But think about what the earth had to go through for the Rocky Mountains to be formed. There was a lot of stress. There was a lot of pressure, a lot of volcanic activity, a lot of earthquakes, things that happened that we probably would not have wanted to be there when it was happening. But now that the earth has gotten through that and we're on this side of it, it's a beautiful thing. We can see God's handiwork because the earth had to go through all of that stress and strain and pressure. Well, today we're going to be talking about reaching your full potential through and because of the difficulties in life. Those difficult times, that stressful situations that we all face are actually what God uses to help us reach our full God-given potential. Problems are a fact of life, and I'm probably going to say that about 20 times during the message today. Problems are a fact of life. There is no getting around it. Now, sometimes you think, well, I wish I didn't have any problems. Well, don't wish that, because if you didn't have any problems or any stress in your life, you would be like the Eastern Plains. You'd be flat and boring.
Or you'd be in the sun.
Or we will need problems to help. I'm just moving on, Nancy. I'm ignoring you this morning. Ignore Nancy this morning. She's sleep deprived because of night vision. So. But we need those stresses. It gives us character. That's really what makes us who we are, is how we have persevered and gone through the different things that we go through. In 1 Peter 4, verses 12 and 13, Peter writes, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Throughout the Bible, we're taught to rejoice in our sufferings. We're taught that suffering is normal. Suffering is a fact of life. It's a normal part of life. Difficulties, stress, difficult people, all those things are just a normal part of life. Trials are not something strange and unusual. In 1 Corinthians 10:13, Paul wrote, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it." Well, that Greek word that's translated temptation can also be translated as trial or calamity. So this passage could have been interpreted or translated, no temptation, no trial, no calamity has overtaken you that is not common to man. Trials, stress, problems are all a natural part of life. They are what make us who we are. We must go through them. There's no avoiding them. Reminds me of some of our guests. You know, Chris and I and our family, we run Ministry Haven, which is a retreat center for pastors and missionaries. We get guests from all over the country, even all over the world. And at least once a summer, if not multiple times a summer, we'll have guests arrive, some of the Flatlander guests, who get here, and one of the first questions they ask is there another way out of here without going down Norwood Hill? Or more generally, is there another way out of here without having to go through windy mountain roads? And we kind of laugh and we say, well, you're on the top of a mountain. We're on a mesa, 7,000 feet. The only way out of here is down curvy mountain roads. Now, you don't have to go down Norwood Hill. There's another way out, but there's no avoiding the windy mountain roads. So you have a choice. You can either stay here with us forever, or if you want to go home, you want to go someplace, you've got to brave the windy mountain roads. There's just no two ways about it. And for us, the same is true. We have to face those windy mountain roads of stress and problems and troubles and tribulations. The only other option is not growing, is just staying the way you are, hiding in fear and letting those situations dictate what you're going to do rather than having the faith and persevering through them and growing through the trials and tribulations. Some people ask a question about successful people. Do successful people have problems? You know, you look at the movie stars and the sports figures and the millionaires and billionaires, and you think, man, they just have it all together. They just don't understand what life truly is because it's all smooth sailing for them. And that's not true. The Bible tells us that everybody has trials and tribulations. But what makes somebody successful is how they bounce back from those trials, what they did with those trials and struggles that they had to face. In fact, General George Patton said success is measured by how high you bounce when you hit bottom. Successful people have hit bottom over and over again. Most millionaires, they say that most millionaires have gone bankrupt. You know, they made their first million, then they went bankrupt. And then they bounced back and then made their second million and on. But because they knew how to persevere through those difficult times. All of us face them. It's what we do with them that matters. In Romans 5, verses 3 and 4, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." See, it's those trials and tribulations and stresses in our life that make us who we are. They help us develop character. So we should rejoice in those difficulties. Now, I know when you're going through them, the last thing on your mind is rejoicing. Oh boy, here's another problem that's going to make me better. But that really is the kind of attitude that we need to have, to persevere through the difficulties, to make the most of them, and for us to become all that God has created us to be. When I was a kid, my dad was a rock hound, and so he had all sorts of lapidary equipment for cutting and polishing rocks and making jewelry and stuff. And one of my favorites was the rock tumbler. Did any of you ever worked with a rock tumbler? Or I'm sure if you've gone to the gift stores and whatnot, you see all these polished little stones, and they've been tumbled. The thing I like about a tumbler is you can take any kind of rock. You know, they're ugly and they have this hard exterior, and you put them in this tumbler, and the magic ingredient, of course, is the water and grit mixture. And you start with a real coarse grit, and you let it run for days and sometimes weeks. And as those rocks are tumbling around in that grit, their sharp edges and their hard exteriors beginning to wear away. And then you change out the water and grit mixture, and then each time you get a finer and finer grit, until finally what comes out after a month or so of tumbling is the inner beauty of those rocks. But that grit is what it took to rub away that exterior, that rough exterior. The grit is like the stresses and problems in our life. See, God uses the stresses and problems of our life. He kind of, in order for us to be what he wants us to be, sometimes he has to put us in a tumbler. And we tumble around, and these difficulties knock off the sharp edges, and our internal beauty begins to show. It's the grit that brings out that internal beauty. And it's the grit of life, the problems and the stresses that bring out the best in us and help us reach our full God-given potential. So as difficult as it is for us to go through these difficult times, just realize that it really is a gift, because it's exercising our faith, and it's making us more and more Christ-like. God is like a sculptor who takes a block of granite and then starts chipping away the pieces to reveal the beautiful sculpture inside. And the way he chips away the pieces that don't belong is through trials, through stresses, through tribulations, through difficulties in our life. In 2 Corinthians 3:18, it says, "And we, who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." See, God's goal is to transform us into the likeness of Christ. And as long as we have that rough exterior like the rocks have, people are not going to see Christ in us. And so he is slowly chipping away, revealing Christ within each one of us. So we're put in the tumbler of life so that the beauty of Christ can be seen in our life. We are called to be transformed people, transformed into the image of Christ. But too often we conform to the ways of the world because of fear, because we withdraw because of the situations that we're in, and we make excuses. You know, if only I didn't have this problem in my life, then I'd be able to be what God wants me to be. Instead of seeing those problems as stepping stones to being what God wants, we see them as barriers and excuses to keep us from being obedient. Let's take a look at a biblical example of somebody who was facing a difficult time, but used it to reach his full potential, at least briefly. It's a passage that you're all familiar with, I'm sure. It's Matthew 14. We'll look at 22 through 32. This is the passage of Peter walking on the water. We'll take little pieces of it and work our way through it. Let's start with Matthew 14, verses 22 through 24. Immediately, he, Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. Now, this passage happens right after the feeding of the 5,000. So the disciples had seen Jesus perform a miracle of feeding over 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes. In fact, they had just gathered 12 baskets full of leftovers right before Jesus dismisses the crowd and sends the disciples off in the boat. And when they get in the boat and start going across the lake, a storm comes up. So they've been battling this storm for hours. They're tired and they're afraid. But in that backdrop, they have the miracle of Jesus in their minds, fresh in their minds. Verses 25 and 26. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. So first they had the problem of the storm, and they're dealing with this storm, and you can imagine 12 fishermen all in this boat. I'm sure they all had their own ideas of how to best weather the storm, so they're frightened from the storm. They're probably arguing with one another, and they're afraid. And they're thinking, we're not going to make it. We're going to die. And the next thing they know, they see this image, and they think it's a ghost, which means they're going to die. This ghost is coming to take them away. It's time for them to die. So they are really, really afraid. Verses 27 through 29. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So notice what happens here. Jesus comes up to the disciples, and they're in the midst of a terrible situation. They're facing storms, and they're afraid, and they think they're going to die. So he says, "Take heart, it is I. I'm here with you. Don't be afraid." Well, the disciples had just seen the miracle, so I'm sure seeing Jesus be there with them helped. It gave them great relief because they know, if Jesus is here, everything's going to be okay. He's in control of the situation. In fact, Peter said, "Lord, call me out. I want to go walking on the water with you." And Jesus said, "Peter, come on down." So Peter went from fearing for his life, to now that Jesus is there with him, he jumps out of the boat and actually goes walking on the water. You see, fear keeps you in the boat, shaking in your boots. But faith gets you out of the boat, jumping in and getting your feet wet. Fear tells us we are doomed, we can't do it. But faith says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Fear tells us, I'm going to die. But faith tells us, Jesus is with me, and I'm going to live life to the fullest. So for a few brief moments, Peter is out there walking on the water with Jesus. But then, verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Have you ever experienced a roller coaster like that? One minute you're afraid, you think you're going to die, and then the next minute you're out walking with the Lord, you're closer to him than ever before, you're doing the impossible, and then fear hits you again and down you go. Our life is like that. We have our roller coaster moments, and it seems to be a constant battle between fear and faith. Fear has us focusing on the storm. Faith has us focusing on the Lord. For Peter, here at the end, his fear overpowered his faith. The wind was still blowing. See, when Jesus said, "It's I," the storm kept blowing. And so it was in the midst of the storm that Peter got out of the boat in the first place. His faith was strong, and he's looking at Jesus, but then something happened where he took his eyes off the Lord and started looking at the storm again. And that's where we, we mess up. Instead of looking at Jesus, we look at the problem. Instead of looking at the problem solver, we're focused on the problem. And he began to sink. And wrapping up verses 31 and 32, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. This storm was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the disciples. And we get on Peter's case. We kind of look down at Peter because the Lord rebuked him and called him, said that he had little faith. But he had more faith than the other 11 apostles in that boat. The disciples all were in the same situation, but Peter is the only one who got out of the boat and walked on water. All of them could have walked on the water that night, but they let their fear overshadow their faith. At least for a brief moment, Peter's faith was stronger than his fear, and he got out of the boat, and he experienced great potential, what it's like walking with Jesus on the water. He's the only human that has experienced walking on the water. Those other 11 could have experienced it, but their faith wasn't strong enough. Peter sunk because doubt crept in, and he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the storm. When the storms of life come your way, which disciple are you going to be? Are you going to be like Peter and get out of the boat and give it a shot? Or are you just going to stay cowering in the boat and wait for the storm to pass? Sitting in your seat this morning are 3 people. The person that you are today, the person that you will be if you just keep living in fear, and then the person you can be if you live by faith. So let me challenge you. Which one are you going to be tomorrow? Are you going to be the same person you are? Are you going to give in to fear and maybe backslide a little bit? Or are you going to be a person of faith and step out and try new things and look at the challenges in life as a stairway to being closer to Christ and being more like Christ? Who will you be a year from now? Are you going to be the same old you? Or are you going to have faith and step out and grow and take on new challenges, take on new opportunities? When the Lord says, come, are you going to jump out of the boat and go walking with him? And when your time comes and you're called home, how will your family remember you? Will they remember you as just steady Eddie, never really doing anything, just always constantly the same, but never really stepping out? Or are they going to remember you as a great person of faith who faced many challenges but didn't let those challenges be an excuse to keep you from obeying the Lord? Are they going to remember you as someone who took on those challenges and was transformed by them positively? That God used those challenges to reveal more and more of Christ, and you continue to grow and mature and be more like Christ, and as the tumbler of life polished you and knocked off all the rough edges, you grew and you were looked up to as a person of great faith. You see, the choice is ours. How are we going to respond to the difficulties that we're presented with in life? Are we going to let the situations define us and cower in fear? Are we going to embrace every difficulty in our path and see it as a stepping stone, not a barrier? The key is to turn your eyes away from the difficulty and turn your eyes upon Jesus. See, when we look full in his wonderful face, all those things, all those difficulties, all those stresses, all those problems grow dim because we're looking at the light of the Lord. And it's a decision that we all have to make. And I know when you're going through it, it's difficult to think of it in a positive way. But that's why we need to talk about it before you hit those difficult times. and be prepared because they're coming. If you're not in the midst of one now, you will be in a few days or in a few weeks. So resolve now that that next wave that comes, that next wave of stress, that next wave of problems, that instead of going under, you're going to ride the wave. You're going to get you on your faith surfboard and ride the wave to see what it is that God wants for that next phase of your life, that next step of your life. Reach your full potential by turning away from the problems and focusing on Jesus.